And this is the 5-minute podcast review for Monday, October 16, 2017. First up is a podcast from the BBC called 50 Things That Made the Modern Economy. It's an entertaining, easy to listen to 50-episode series, with each episode only running around 9 minutes. And any list like 50 Things That Made the Modern Economy is always going to be subjective, but the angle here is not just great ideas per se, but those that had a big effect, sometimes an unintended or not obviously apparent effect on the way our modern economy has been shaped. So it's things like barbed wire, the elevator, the limited liability company, air conditioning, the S-bend, the barcode, the IKEA Billy bookcase, and you can Google Billy bookcase and you'll definitely recognise what that is. And speaking of Google, there's an episode on Google itself. Each episode is like a 9-minute mini documentary covering the origins of the idea, right through to its place in the world today, and all delivered with a wry British sensibility. So check out 50 Things That Made the Modern Economy. You'll find it wherever you search for podcasts, or just use the link I've put on your screen. Next podcast is Team Effort with Ed Kavalee. The best way to describe this podcast is to think of a typical FM breakfast or drive time radio program, the kind typically hosted by a couple of comic personalities. Now, imagine this type of program with all the constraints of broadcast media lifted, the constraints on the language you can or can't use, the constraints on having to moderate your storytelling and jokes to the tastes of a broad audience, including kids, not offending advertisers, all that sort of stuff. Then that's what Team Effort with Ed Kavalee sounds like. The word team in the title is actually an acronym for the first names of the 4 regular hosts, Tony Martin, Ed Kavalee, Ash Williams and Lawrence Mooney. These names will be familiar to Australian radio listeners as hosts of the various FM radio breakfast and drive time programs over the years. And the Team Effort podcast sounds a bit like the radio show they might have made if management would have let them get away with it. There's also a bit of shop talk around the Australian radio industry, including some commentary on various radio management personalities. That's not necessarily career-enhancing talk for the hosts, but it's all this stuff that gives Team Effort its edge, and to me is what makes it laugh out loud funny versus the packaged and dumbed-down commercial radio breakfast shows we typically hear. So Team Effort is Australian, but the content is fairly universal, and I reckon it's worth checking out, mainly for its comedy, no matter where you live. In fact, on that point, I've actually had regular email asking me to dig up more non-US originated podcasts, which I think I've been doing all along anyhow. The first 2 podcasts on this episode so far are just the latest examples. Anyhow, that's Team Effort with Ed Kavalee. Third podcast this episode, which is actually a swing back to the US, is called My Shity Podcast. And as the host says, it's so shitty, there's only one T in shitty. So basically the host, Adam Copeland, started out interviewing friends and family about their jobs and what was shitty about their job. Adam himself worked and maybe still does work in a bar, and so many of his guests are also connected to the service industry, but not all. Guests have included a tattoo removalist, a graphic designer, a massage therapist, a drummer, a nurse, and many others across the nearly 40 episodes up so far. Now, on the surface, My Shitty Podcast might sound like many podcasts out there looking for an idea and resorting to less than compelling interviews with family and friends, but there's some magic with My Shitty Podcast that makes it worth checking out. A part of it is Adam, the host's personality, but it's probably also the sometimes extraordinary openness of his interviewees. Often it's a bit like they've forgotten they've been recorded, so it has a great realness to it. If you ever want to know what you are probably doing to really annoy the wait staff at a restaurant, cafe or bar, check out episode 1 with Cassandra the bartender. And there's one other gimmick that's a part of each episode of My Shitty Podcast. Here's a clip from the first episode where Adam, the host, sets it up.
Well, again, My Shitty Podcast. So I like to end with, do you have a poop story?
Oh.
Doesn't even have to be your own. But if you've got a good poop story, I'd like you to share that.
Fuck.
If not...
I do have a poop story.
You got a poop story?
I do. It's kind of embarrassing, though.
Oh, come on. Is it embarrassing?
Yeah.
You want me to tell a poop story?
No.
You know my
I know
poop
your
story.
You think you know my poop story, too.
Do I?
So the last time I shat myself as an adult...
Yes, paint the picture. What day is it? Where are you?
I'm in Mexico.
Oh, God, yeah. I like this. Oh, I hope a swimsuit's involved.
No, so
Damn
I traveled to Mexico for 6 months, and I basically had to.
So there you go. And the surprising, or maybe not so surprising thing is that every interviewee I've heard so far has had a personal shitty story which they enthusiastically roll out on cue, including even Adam's mother when she appeared on the Mother's Day episode back in May this year. So that's my Shitty podcast, and remember it's Shitty with one T. On to podcast number 4, Squaring the Strange. Squaring the Strange is a bit of a different take on the skeptical genre of podcasts. If you listen to The Skeptic's Guide to the Universe, which I do, I reviewed it way back in episode 1, then you might find Squaring the Strange interesting complementary listening. Each episode of Squaring the Strange tends to focus on a particular issue, like urban legends, conspiracy theories, internet stories doing the rounds, or sometimes more traditional skeptic fodder like psychics or the Roswell incident, and it subjects them to critical thinking and evidence-based analysis to see how they stack up. Basically, focusing on 1 or 2 issues per episode allows for a deep dive and a good opportunity to listen to a couple of practiced critical thinkers working things through. If you want a good episode to sample, I'd suggest episode 10 called Of Emperors and Clothes. It's not necessarily a typical episode, but it takes a great look at the skeptical lessons in the famous Hans Christian Andersen tale of The Emperor's New Clothes, and the tale's expose of the psychological traps we can all fall into in everyday life. Now, you might think you know the story and the lessons from The Emperor's New Clothes, but I can pretty much guarantee this episode of Squaring the Strange will expose you to whole new layers and twists in the story. Anyhow, check out Squaring the Strange. I've put a link to the podcast feed and also a specific link to the Emperor's New Clothes episode on your screen. Last podcast this episode is called Actual Innocence. Actual Innocence, as the name suggests, tells the stories of people who were wrongly imprisoned for crimes they didn't commit, sometimes wrongly imprisoned for 20 years or more before being exonerated. There's something horrifically fascinating about this subject, a bit like being buried alive. Apparently, the idea for the Actual Innocence podcast came from season 1 of the Serial podcast and its central theme that maybe an innocent person was in prison. So, while the serial case of Adnan Syed is still playing out in court, the episodes of Actual Innocence deal with resolved cases, people who are found to be actually innocent. In most cases, we hear a lot from the wrongly convicted themselves and about how they got convicted, about their time in prison, and about how they got exonerated. If you need a booster shot for the idea of the presumption of innocence or the idea of guilty beyond reasonable doubt, then pick off a few episodes of Actual Innocence. And that's it for this episode of the 5-Minute Podcast Review, where we looked at 50 things that made the modern economy, team effort with Ed Kavalee, my Shitty podcast, Squaring the Strange, and Actual Innocence. See you in the next episode. Thanks for listening.